April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above occupied France, the cockpit glass is rimed with ice, your breath is loud in the oxygen mask, and the sky is full of enemies. Below, B-17 bombers drag contrails across the pale blue. Above, sleek Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 tighten into attack. And in the middle of this killing ground flies an aircraft almost everyone expects to fail. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the oversized American fighter the Luftwaffe has already christened the flying milk bottle. To German pilots, this World War II intruder looks like a joke, too heavy, too clumsy, absurdly large for a single-engine fighter. What you and I are about to see is how that joke turns into a nightmare. For years, the Luftwaffe has dominated European skies with agile Bf-109s and Fw-190s flown by hardened veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The new American units above France in 1943 are something very different. Young, untested pilots flying a fighter that seems to break every rule of classic air combat. Everyone believes that nimble, lightweight machines win dogfights. The Americans have brought a brute that looks more like a small bomber. But the truth hiding inside those thick wings and that barrel-shaped fuselage is that mass, altitude performance, and 8 heavy Browning machine guns are about to rewrite the logic of air war. If the Thunderbolt fails, the consequences are enormous. The daylight bomber campaign that is hammering German industry depends on fighter escort. Without a protector that can fight its way through the Luftwaffe, 8th Air Force crews will keep dying in burning bombers, cities will remain unbombed, and the Allied timetable for invading Europe could shatter. If the P-47 works, it will help tear the heart out of German air power. In this documentary, we are going to follow that transformation. How a machine that German aces mocked as a clumsy target became one of the most feared fighters of the war, and how the Luftwaffe's laughter died out long before the last Thunderbolt landed. The story begins not in Europe but in Washington in June 1940 with a sense of panic. France has fallen in weeks. British cities are bracing for Luftwaffe raids. The U.S. Army Air Corps knows its existing fighters are already being overtaken by events. It sends urgent requirements to Republic Aviation, whose chief designer is a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli. On paper, the request is straightforward: a high-altitude interceptor that can meet or beat the Luftwaffe's best. Kartveli looks at the performance curves coming out of Europe and makes a radical choice. Instead of trying to build a slightly better Bf-109, he decides to build something entirely different. A huge, heavily armed, turbocharged fighter wrapped around one of the most powerful radial engines in American production, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. When the XB-47B prototype lifts off for the first time in May 1941, the airplane on the runway barely resembles the sleek fighters of the day. Empty, it weighs far more than the earlier P-43 Lancer. A labyrinth of ducts and piping carries exhaust gases to a turbo-supercharger in the rear fuselage, giving the whole aircraft a swollen, almost ungainly profile. Test pilots eye the big four-bladed propeller, the tall landing gear, the bulk of the fuselage, and mutter, "That thing is supposed to be a fighter." At low altitude it feels heavy, but when they climb into the mid-20s and 30s, the aircraft comes alive. While conventional engines lose power as the air thins, the turbocharged Double Wasp keeps pushing close to its sea-level output. Kartveli has built an interceptor that is not pretty, but it is brutally effective where the U.S. expects to fight, high above Europe, alongside the bombers. The Thunderbolt does not become a terror to the Luftwaffe overnight. First, it terrifies the Americans who have to learn to fly it. When Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke takes command of the 56th Fighter Group and begins converting it to P-47s in late 1942, he is openly skeptical. Training accidents pile up. The big fighter punishes mistakes. If a pilot mishandles power on takeoff, torque can flip the airplane. If he lands carelessly, the long gear helps it swing and ground loop. If he dives too steeply, the aircraft accelerates so fast that the controls freeze from compressibility, a phenomenon few pilots have experienced before. Between the autumn of 1942 and early 1943, the 56th loses aircraft and men without ever seeing a German. Yet a few pilots begin to understand what Kartveli has given them. Beneath the unforgiving handling lies an airframe that can take staggering punishment, a radial engine that keeps turning after hits that would instantly kill an inline power plant, and a battery of 8.50 caliber guns that, if brought to bear, can erase a fighter, a truck, or a locomotive in seconds. One of the young men who senses this potential is Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, an Oklahoma farm boy who, by war's end, will rank among America's top aces in Europe. The Thunderbolt's combat debut over occupied France in April and May 1943 is not reassuring. P-47C models from the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups climb out across the Channel to meet German opposition. Above them, Jagdgeschwader 26 and other elite units form up in their familiar FW-190s and BF-109s, flown by men who have been at war since 1939. They see the fat-bellied newcomers and burst out laughing. Compared to the slim Spitfires they know, the Thunderbolt looks ridiculous. Greenhouse canopy, stubby wings, fuselage like a beer keg. They hit from below and from the side, forcing turning fights where their lighter fighters have the edge. In those first weeks, the numbers favor the Luftwaffe. American units lose far more Thunderbolts than German fighters fall to their guns. RAF veterans quietly suggest that their American allies might have chosen the wrong horse. Jokes spread that the best evasive move in a P-47 is to unstrap and run around inside the roomy cockpit. But the wreckage coming back to English airfields tells a different story. Thunderbolts that manage to return are often riddled with holes, cannon strikes through the wings, elevators chewed up, fuselage skin torn and peeled, but still landable. Ground crews count dozens upon dozens of hits. The air-cooled radial lacks radiators and coolant lines, where a single puncture would doom a liquid-cooled BF-109 or Spitfire. The R-2800 often shrugs and keeps running. At the same time, whenever a P-47 pilot keeps a German fighter in his sights long enough to squeeze off a full burst, the gun camera film shows astonishing destruction. 8 synchronized Brownings, harmonized so their streams of bullets intersect at a chosen distance, form a deadly cone. A second or two inside that zone is usually fatal. On June 26, 1943, that combination of toughness and firepower explodes into legend. Near Le Mans, France, 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson is flying a Thunderbolt of the 61st Fighter Squadron as part of a large escort formation. High above, FW-190s from IIJG-26, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutt's gallant roll into a classic bounce from the sun. Johnson, flying near the rear, is caught in a crossing fire of 20 cannon and machine guns. Shells tear into his P-47. The engine cowl shatters. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the cockpit. The canopy is smashed. Metal fragments rip into Johnson's face and legs. He reaches for the canopy handle, intending to bail out, only to find it jammed solid. A shell has warped the rails and locked the frame shut. Trapped in his wrecked airplane at high altitude, half blind and bleeding, he does the only thing left: fights the controls and points the crippled fighter toward the English Channel. What happens next should not be possible. With oil streaked across the windscreen, control cables partly severed, and the engine coughing and shaking, the P-47 somehow keeps flying. Then a lone FW-190 from the same German unit finds him limping home at low speed. The German pilot lines up behind the wounded Thunderbolt and empties his remaining ammunition into it. More hits slam into the wings and tail. Johnson huddles behind the armor plate and waits for the airplane to disintegrate. It doesn't. When the German finally runs out of ammunition, he pulls alongside, looks at the shot-to-pieces American fighter, and in a moment captured forever in Johnson's memory, gives a small, almost respectful wave before turning back toward France. Against all logic, the P-47 staggers on to England and crash lands at Manston. When mechanics examine it, they stop counting holes after 200. Structural members are severed, armor is dented and scorched, and yet the machine has brought its pilot home. For Hub Zemk, now leading his group in combat, Johnson's survival proves what he has been trying to teach his men. The Thunderbolt cannot win by imitating German fighters. It has to fight its own kind of war. Zemk drills his pilots: stay high, avoid low-altitude turning contests, dive hard, hit once and climb away. Out of that hard-won experience comes the tactic that will define P-47 combat: boom and zoom. Thunderbolt squadrons learn to start their missions in the thin air above 30,000 feet, where the turbocharged radial gives them a performance edge. From there, they watch the Luftwaffe assemble for bomber attacks. When German fighters move in, P-47s roll inverted, dive at tremendous speed and fire only when the enemy fills the gun sight. At the bottom of the dive, they use momentum to arc back up toward altitude, leaving any survivors struggling to follow. German pilots who live through these attacks describe flying into moving walls of metal. A Thunderbolt carries roughly 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough for more than half a minute of firing, while many German fighters carry only a few seconds' worth of cannon shells. The P-47's growing reputation is hardened in missions like the deep raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943. Those operations reveal a serious weakness: limited range even with drop tanks, but they also confirm how lethal the Thunderbolt can be when used properly. Major David Schilling leads P-47s against twin-engine Bf-110s, tasked with smashing B-17s and B-24s from long range. Diving from altitude, his Thunderbolts ignore defensive fire, close to killing distance, and open up. Gunner testimony from surviving German crews describes American fighters falling on them like hammers, their fire so dense that a Bf-110 can break into separate flaming pieces in a single 2-second burst. After these missions, Luftwaffe reports begin to describe the P-47 not as a clumsy curiosity, but as a serious escort fighter, whose guns are brutally effective against both single and twin-engined opponents. As 1943 turns into 1944, the Luftwaffe makes another discovery. The higher the fight, the worse their odds become. Above roughly 25,000 feet, many German engines with mechanical superchargers lose power. The turbocharged double Wasp in the P-47 does not. In October 1943, one of Germany's most successful aces, Hans Philipp, leads his unit against American bombers near Bremen in his FW-190A up near the bomber stream. His once nimble fighter feels sluggish. Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group dive from still higher altitude, and in the swirling fight Philipp's aircraft explodes. He does not survive. His loss rattles the German fighter arm. If a veteran with more than 200 victories can be killed so quickly by these American machines, what chance do the younger pilots have? High-level reports to Hermann Goering now list the Thunderbolt as a dangerous opponent at altitude, with exceptional structural strength and a dive speed flirting with the edge of the sound barrier. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt itself was changing. New P-47D variants arriving in England carried a Hamilton Standard paddle blade propeller that finally gave the big fighter a serious climb. Pilots now felt the aircraft surge upward when they opened the throttle. The turbocharged Pratt Whitney R-2800 still pushed hard at altitudes where many German engines were fading. On the ground, troops learned to recognize the deeper, hammering sound of those blades before the fighters appeared. Tied to the squat silhouette and 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, that noise became a warning that something was about to die. Range improved as well. With external fuel tanks under wings and fuselage, Thunderbolts pushed farther into the Reich as escorts for B-17s and B-24s. 8th Air Force groups built layered defenses around the bomber streams, some P-47s high overhead as top cover, others on the flanks, still others roaming ahead to break up German formations. The P-51 Mustang would eventually take over the deepest missions, but on many raids the first and last enemy fighters a Luftwaffe pilot saw were P-47s diving out of the sun and climbing away again. At the same time, the P-47 was discovering a second identity under 9th Air Force, fighter bomber. New D-series models sprouted bomb racks and rocket rails. Thunderbolt pilots were unleashed on the infrastructure of the German army, rail junctions, convoys, bridges, fuel dumps. Short, brutal gun runs shredded trucks and gun positions. Bombs and rockets blew apart tanks and locomotives. German officers warned that daytime movement under clear skies was becoming suicidal. D-Day made that reality unmistakable. On June 6, 1944, hundreds of Thunderbolts joined the air umbrella over Normandy. German pilots who tried to reach the beaches flew into stacked layers of Allied aircraft, many of them P-47s, and most sorties were broken up long before they could influence the fighting below. For troops moving along the roads toward the front, the sudden appearance of low-flying Thunderbolts often meant that entire columns of vehicles might vanish in a few passes. The same airplane was transforming the air war in the Pacific. In New Guinea, the 348th Fighter Group under Colonel Neil Kirby flew P-47s on long missions over jungle, mountains, and sea. On an October 1943 mission near WWII, Kirby led a small P-47 formation against a much larger Japanese force and personally shot down several aircraft, an action that earned the Medal of Honor and showed Japanese pilots what the Thunderbolt could do. Aces such as Saburo Sakai later described seeing 20 cannon shells explode against a Thunderbolt, while the big fighter kept flying and answered with torrents of .50 caliber fire that tore apart more fragile aircraft. To handle Pacific distances, Republic developed the P-47N with extended, wet wings carrying more fuel. Back over Germany in late 1944, the P-47 met the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. On paper, the comparison looked hopeless for the propeller-driven fighter. The jet's top speed seemed to make it untouchable. In reality, Me-262s were slow and vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and had engines that disliked abrupt power changes. Thunderbolt units adapted quickly. They patrolled near jet bases, circling above approach corridors and runways. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Mayer dove from altitude in a P-47, caught a climbing Me-262 just after takeoff, closed to a few hundred yards and unleashed a short burst. The jet broke apart in midair, one of several jet kills credited to Thunderbolt pilots. All of this rested on an industrial base that Germany could never match. Republic Aviation ultimately built more than 15,000 P-47s at plants in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. Each aircraft embodied tens of thousands of parts and a complex 18-cylinder engine, yet American factories kept delivering machines that could be ferried straight into combat units. Ammunition plants poured out millions of .50 caliber cartridges each month, and tankers carried high-octane fuel across the Atlantic to feed squadrons of P-47s. As American activity increased, the Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and spare parts, flew less and less. Pilot training widened the gap further. By 1944, a typical Thunderbolt pilot reached the front with hundreds of flight hours and extensive gunnery practice. Facing him more and more often was a German replacement pilot rushed through a shortened program because fuel and instructors were scarce. Many of these young men had less than 100 hours total time in the air when they first met P-47s over Germany. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper. Airfields lay cratered, aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel, and veteran aces were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Frontline German troops and the few remaining fighter pilots alike spoke of Jabo fear, a visceral reaction to the sound of Allied fighter bombers. To them, the thunder of a P-47's approach meant one thing: dive for cover or risk being caught in a storm of bombs, rockets, and tracers. When peace finally came and former enemies met again in reunions and interviews, the change in tone was clear. Men like Adolf Galland, who had once commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, openly admitted that they had mocked the Thunderbolt when it arrived in 1943. They saw only a bulky fuselage and assumed it could not fight. They had missed the deeper truth. The P-47 represented a way of war built on survivability, dive speed, heavy firepower, and mass production. Other veterans, such as Joseph Pips, Priller of JG-26, later described the Thunderbolt as one of the most effective fighter-bombers of the conflict, a machine whose guns rarely jammed, and whose units always seemed able to replace yesterday's losses with fresh pilots and aircraft. Today, when you stand beneath a restored P-47 in a museum and look up at its thick wings and huge radial engine, you are not just seeing a World War II fighter. You are looking at the answer to the question that opened this story. How did a machine the Luftwaffe once laughed at help destroy it? In 1943, German pilots pointed at the Thunderbolt and joked about flying milk bottles. By 1945, there were very few of them left to joke about anything. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had done exactly what its designer intended: survive, hit hard, and keep coming back until the enemy's courage and resources were exhausted, and the skies above Europe and the Pacific belonged to someone else.